Hi, welcome to another episode of From the Vaults, a series of presentations from the Rare Book and Special Collections Division. I'm Mark Dimunation, I'm Chief of the Division. I'm sitting here with my colleague Amanda Zimmerman, who is our reference librarian in the division, and we're here today to discuss a significant landmark document that was created in the middle of the Revolution.
Now, Mark, I see two documents here that look somewhat familiar, but a little bit different. What can you tell me about them?
Well, what we have here are two copies of the Declaration of Independence produced in Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776. There are two printings, and I'll go into the discussion of the second one. The one that's in front of me, however, is the landmark document of the American Revolution. This is the first appearance in print of the Declaration of Independence.
Unbelievable.
So it was produced on the night of July 4th. The Continental Congress had met and voted, and presumably a fair copy of the manuscript, we assume Thomas Jefferson's copy, was walked across the street to the print shop of John Dunlap, who stayed up all night and produced a typeset edition and printed it on the early morning of July 5th. Copies that were later dispersed to members, safety committees, members of the Congress, and of course a copy was sent to England. We refer to it as the Dunlap broadside. It's really the first appearance of the text. People have other visual notions of what the Declaration of Independence looks like, but this is the piece that first took that manuscript and put it into text.
That's incredibly fascinating.
It's an important moment, not only in terms of the story of the American Revolution, but also the story of American printing.
Absolutely.
So this was printed by John Dunlap, an American printer who was born in Ireland. He was sent to his uncle in Philadelphia at the age of 10 to apprentice as a printer.
Oh my.
And 10 years later found himself acquiring the business from his uncle and began to develop a printing business. He was at the corner of 2nd and Main in Philadelphia, which is only a few blocks away from what we now call Independence Hall. So he was a convenient printer to turn to. He was a likely candidate to take this on, in part because he was already the official printer for the Continental Congress.
Interesting.
And secondly, he was about to prepare to launch a larger scale production, which turns into the Philadelphia Packet, which ultimately becomes the first daily newspaper in America. And so he had a slightly larger press that he could set type. So this broadside, which in printing terms is a single page with printing on one side, it was well situated in order to create this document.
Fascinating.
So he's an interesting individual. He not only printed the Declaration of Independence and produced it, but he then goes on to follow the Continental Congress when Philadelphia is invaded the next year in 1777 and people fled. He fled town along with the Congress, who moved to York, Pennsylvania. He came back to then go on to print paper money, and ultimately also printed the Journal of the Continental Congress and the working copies of the Constitution when it was under debate.
So he's an incredibly influential printer at this time.
Actually, besides Thomas Jefferson, he is at the center of these conversations in a physical, material way. Yes, and it's an interesting story of, especially in the colonies, as you know, printing was controlled by the English, so American printing really emphasized broadsides, pamphlets, what we call bread and butter printing, which allowed them to be very fast in terms of keeping the communication open.
So it seems like these are incredibly rare. Are these our only copies?
Well, no, we actually have two copies of the Dunlap broadside here at the Library of Congress. The one that we have on the table was owned by Peter Force. Peter Force was a collector of Americana, also an American politician, newspaper editor, and also incidentally, twice mayor of Washington, D.C. His importance to us, however, is that he accumulated a vast collection of American resources, not only printed, but also, more importantly, archival, including the papers of American and British military officers and statesmen. And the Library of Congress acquired the bulk of that collection, which also contained his copy of the Declaration of Independence. It had been signed over to him by a gentleman named Ridgely. His signature is on the back. turning it over to, as he indicates, to Colonel Force, and that's how the piece came to us.
It's quite a gift.
Yes, it is, and well, it was a gift. Yes, a gift to Mr. Force, and then a purchase by the Library of Congress. Even though there were only 26 copies, we do know a lot about how this could have been created. And there's a very interesting point about this particular copy, which is in that run of production, as you know, when we talk about printing, we often look for things that change along the way, because that helps us understand when our particular copy may have been printed. And it turns out that the signatures, such as they are at the bottom of the document, being signed by the President of the Congress, John Hancock, and attested to by Secretary Thompson. Underneath it, where it says Philadelphia, printed by John Dunlap, the word Philadelphia in this sequence of printing shifts. And our copy, the P is under the N as opposed to under the comma, which means somewhere along the line they stopped the printing, adjusted the press a little bit, and continued to print. So we have what's referred to as a second state of the document.
That is fascinating. And it's fascinating that such a tiny change is, I mean, first of all, to be able to study a document like this for such minuscule changes is really incredible. And then to be able to understand what that means for the entire printing process.
Absolutely. And, you know, we don't know what happened on the night of July 4th when they walked over the manuscript. We like to think romantically that Benjamin Franklin, the master printer of America, and John Adams were quietly sitting watching Dunlap prepare this typesetting. But even John Adams later recalled, we were in great haste, is how he describes the situation. And modern scholars looking at the various copies that we have say that the document only indicates that this was a very sort of flurried evening of activity. There are pages where the watermarks get flipped, where obviously they printed on the back side of the paper that they were intending to. There are other copies that were folded too early, and thus the wet ink transferred. And one person described it as a circus of stray punctuation points floating across the document as they were printing. So this adjustment in our case is just one of those moments, all with the effort to have this produced by the morning of July 5th, 1776, to make the announcement official.
How incredible that following the printing can create such an atmosphere of the night, right? The circus of punctuation, the chaos of how quickly things were being folded and sent off. I mean, just the physical process tells us so much about what their experience was.
And also the notion and meaning of the document itself. Now, we do have another copy. It's housed in the manuscript division. It's a copy that was held by George Washington. On July 6th, John Hancock had a copy delivered to Washington, who was with his troops in New York. It arrived on July 9th. New York was in a state of great tension and nervousness, I might say, because the harbor was filled with British Navy. There was a real kind of discernible revolutionary temperament developing in New York. And Washington had the Declaration read to his troops at the steps of City Hall on July 9th. And that evening, a raucous crowd of supporters of this sentiment tore down the statue of George III. Now, this statue, in fact, was broken down and smelted into 42,000 bits of ammunition for the colonial army, so it had a very poetic demise. But nonetheless, that gave us a second copy. The Washington fragment is torn at about line 54. We're missing the bottom third, but it has signs of having been folded, likely in somebody's pocket at some point. And so the two copies together really tell the story of the meaning of this physical object itself.
Fascinating. So, Mark, you mentioned that this is the first time we see the Declaration in print. Now, I know that there's a copy of the Declaration of Independence at the National Archives. So what's the story?
Yes, that's correct. There is a manuscript version of the Declaration of Independence at the National Archives. It's often referred to as the Matlack copy. He was the scribe for the Continental Congress, or more typically the engrossed copy of the Declaration. it is not in the chronological sequence of production. It's an interesting moment. This is the printing that comes off the draft that was walked across the street from the Continental Congress and was produced and distributed long before the Continental Congress, I think on July 19th, passed a resolution saying that we needed to create a copy of the manuscript that had everybody's signature on it. So it prompted what was called the engrossed copy, a handwritten parchment document of the Declaration, in which all members of Congress were asked to come back and sign. So this went on into July and August. So it's after the fact, but it becomes the official record of the signatures.
Right.
But it is a manuscript. It's sent nowhere. It's a historical moment.
Right.
But it is not the vehicle by which the intention of the colonies is delivered to England or to the other constituents of the American people. So the engrossed copy is very important because visually that's our notion of the Declaration. But it only brings back again the emphasis on the printed document itself. But the sequencing of the Declaration is really a series of manuscript after manuscript to print to manuscript again.
And can you talk a little bit about that process of this document coming to be?
Sure. It's the story is a complicated one, but it always comes back to the Continental Congress. While it began to appear evident that in these conversations, remember Lexington and Concord had already happened. This was not necessarily a theoretical conversation that was going on in the Continental Congress. We were under attack, or at least we felt threatened by the presence of the English in a way that we hadn't previously, and we were also being taxed heavily. And they felt that some kind of action needed to be taken. When it became evident that we were in fact going to issue a statement, a committee of 5 was appointed. Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Livingston, and Sherman were appointed. They all, because of his reputation of both steadiness and his ability with prose, essentially turned to Thomas Jefferson and said, why don't you write it up? Which he did. And that's when the story gets complicated. We don't know how many drafts Jefferson produced, whether he produced them by himself or not. We have another manuscript by Thomas Jefferson that he retained and kept in his papers, which are held here at the Library of Congress. And that's a much more expansive draft of the Declaration, 4 pages, often referred to as the rough draft or the fair rough draft. It does, however, contain emendations and changes, 86 of them. Some of them rather substantial. And some which are a little surprising. We know, for example, that Adams and Franklin went through and made numerous changes, much to Jefferson's dismay, I might add. And in one case, Jefferson's language of "we hold these rights to be sacred and undeniable" is altered by Ben Franklin, who gives us the phrase, "we hold these truths to be
self-evident."
You got it. So the language that we often associate with the Declaration of Independence actually comes from an editorial process. We have another draft of the Declaration, also in Thomas Jefferson's hand, that is much more directly connected to the text of the Dunlap broadside. It's 4 pages. It was preserved in Jefferson's papers. But it also is heavily edited and in some cases actually redacted. In several instances, Franklin and Adams went in and made changes, and then it went to the actual session of Congress. References to controlling slavery were removed. There were a number of negotiations and agreements that were made to make the document acceptable for the 12 out of the 13 colonies that could vote. New York was not allowed to vote in this session, although they could participate in the conversation. But some of these changes are not only substantial, but linger with us today. For example, it's Franklin who took Jefferson's phrase that we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable and alters it to read, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So there are moments in the Declaration that become part of the process of this. Ultimately, whatever manuscript made its way over to John Dunlap's printing of the broadside, we don't really know which document was used as the typesetting document and whether it even survived. We do know a couple of other things about it. One copy of the broadside was actually pasted into the ongoing journals of the Continental Congress, indicating that it had been signed by Hancock and attested to by Thompson. We also know that this whole process was done so that July 4th, which was the day of the vote, would be marked as the day of independence. John Adams actually wanted July 2nd to be the Independence Day because that was the day in which the document was drafted.
Oh,
That
fascinating.
is, that was the day in which our Declaration emerged. Whatever the case, the fair copy went over and this document was printed, and by order of Congress, it was issued and released.
Fascinating. This is incredible. And it's incredible that we have not only one, but two of these in our collections. Now, we've talked a lot about this piece, the Dunlap broadside, and we have this whole other broadside out. What can you tell me about it?
Yes, it's a very interesting piece for several accounts. I might first note that that transition from print to the engrossed copy had a moment of change. You may not want to add too much emphasis to it, but there is a moment of language where you begin to have a sense that the importance of this document is taking hold. In the original printing of the Declaration, it says in Congress, a declaration by the representatives of the United States of America. The engrossed copy says a resolution voted on unanimously by the 13 United States. So there's a sense of meaning and presence that happens in the engrossed copy. What we're looking at here is the second printing of the Declaration of Independence. In January of 1777, the Second Continental Congress passed a resolution that the contents of the Declaration of Independence be made more readily available. Remember, the Dunlap broadside was distributed to committees of safety, members of Congress, to individuals who needed to know, including England. This was a text that they wanted to be as readily available to the American people as possible. And although there were several iterations of the Dunlap broadside in newspapers, the second broadside printing happened because Mary Catherine Goddard, who was a printer in Baltimore, rose to the request of the Continental Congress and offered that her press be used to create this document, even though the very act of printing this would be seen as an act of treason on the part of the British. And so one of the great women printers of the 18th century in America produced this document, which is significant for a number of reasons. One is that it does, in fact, allow the text to be transmitted more directly to the people who are most affected by it, the American people. But secondly, it is the first time that the American people actually see who signed the Declaration of Independence. All the members who had signed that we see in the engrossed copy are now being transferred to the second printing. So for many Americans, this is the first time not only that they read the full text, but they understand who is it that signed this document. Right. She's a very interesting person. She was postmaster of Baltimore for at least 15 years, and at one point, a very misguided individual came in and suggested that perhaps a woman shouldn't be doing this and tried to have her removed, which only led to Baltimore rallying to her cause and had her reinstated.
Wow.
And then she went on to produce several publications and journals and became a substantial and important printer in Baltimore and in America. What's even more interesting, although we don't know how many copies of this was printed, we know that there are 26 copies of the Dunlap broadside that are surviving. There are only 9 of the Catherine Goddard
Unbelievable.
That are surviving. You know, one of the things that both of these documents indicate to us, although the concepts that Jefferson in particular promoted, that we have the right to freedom and happiness, and that all men are created equal, and that we have an obligation to fight for these rights. These principles weave through American history and our notion of our democracy, but they're established and proven in these documents that come out of printing in early America.
Really fascinating. I mean, we think about these things, we learn about them from a very early age, and so they become these larger than life, abstract kind of moments. But to see the physical rendering of those ideas and the moment that these represent in changing history is absolutely just unbelievable.
Yes, I think it's the moment in which the decision to free ourselves from the control of England is actually made physical and material. They're great documents.
They really are. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you.